please turn to, no, I'm reading it. I will be reading Annie Dillard, a short, I guess you'd say poem by Annie Dillard, one of my favorite authors, poets. We are here to abet creation and to witness to it, to notice each other's beautiful face and complex nature, so that creation need not play to an empty house. Is it loud enough for people? Okay.
Should we turn this big fan off? Is that bothering anybody? Yeah? Okay. Dayon, you could put the smaller one on. It's not as loud. Okay. Better? Okay. Welcome to First Parish in Milton. My name is Lisa White, and I am the worship assistant for Tasha Bello, the lay leader of today's service. A special thank you to Dayon Drisdom, who's playing piano for us today. Thanks, Dayon. I don't think I see any new faces, so I'm going to just skip over the welcome to new people. And is everybody hearing okay now? Okay. If you haven't already, could you please make sure to silence your cell phone? And a reminder that our lay-led services are our summer lay-led services are a little different from our minister-led services during the rest of the year. They're often shorter and often quite different from our typical services. The lay leader is often sharing something that they care a lot about or sharing something very personal about herself. So this is just a way that we get to know each other better and possibly deeper than we would otherwise. And it's a way that we grow together as a community. Come into this place of peace and let its silence heal your spirit. Come into this place of memory and let its history warm your soul. Come into this place of prophecy and power and let its vision change your heart. Now please join me in our opening hymn, which is number 346 in the gray hymnal. Our chalice lighting words this morning: flame of fire, spark of the universe that warmed our ancestral hearth, agent of life and death, symbol of truth and freedom. We strive to understand ourselves and our earthly home. Please join me in the call to worship, which can be found on the laminated card in your pew. Come, let us gather. We gather to celebrate the sacred within and among us. We strive to practice acceptance, forgiveness, and compassion. Together, we work to build a world with justice and compassion. Come, let us gather together. I think I had the wrong words there, but
Hello, everyone. This morning, I've planned a journey through my dysfunctional childhood, and for some reason, you've decided to join me. So here we go. I would hazard a guess that each decade settles on several words or maybe phrases that define some aspect of that generation's human condition. One of my three younger sisters, I was the oldest of four, went off to college in the early 70s and returned one spring day after her sophomore year declaring that we girls had grown up in a dysfunctional family. It was a powerful word to her, one she picked up after enrolling in a second semester psychology class, and once she learned it, she owned it and used it with regularity. At the time, I might well have rolled my eyes. During my formative years in the 50s through the 60s, my three sisters and I lived a mile outside of the small college town of Hamilton, New York, in a 3-bedroom ranch house shared with our two parents. I would describe us as an insular family unit. But it wasn't until I was in my early 40s that I sought out a therapist to help me flesh out this idea of dysfunction, to help me distinguish between what might have been dysfunctional about our family and what was generally defined as being typical of the family unit back in the 50s and 60s, a time, of course, when most Hamilton mothers raised the children while the fathers ran or fed the town or taught in the classrooms of Colgate University, the latter being true in my case. Getting reacquainted with my high school classmates over a beer at the Colgate Inn during numerous class reunions since our graduation had led to revealing stories and more questions. Was I and were many of my classmates from families, were we from families that were dysfunctional in different ways, or was that simply a buzzword that we young adults used haphazardly, a word that is still very much in use all these decades later? Since those early years growing up in Hamilton, and with the help of that therapist, I have revisited those decades, the years before I started my first job as a 9th grade English teacher at Tappan Zee High School, and I've concluded that my sister was right. Our family unit was dysfunctional. That word absolutely fit. So it was with a former English teacher's interest in how certain words can remain static or morph into new ones with more generalized meanings that an article in the May 16th issue of the New York Times by Lisa Miller caught my eye. She titled her article, "When Did Everything Become a Journey?" She asks. When did changing our hair, getting divorced, taking spa vacations become journeys and no longer simply things we do? Linguistics professor Jesse Egbert of Northern Arizona University, another contributor to this article, weighed in, stating that The use of the word journey, the noun, has nearly doubled in American English since 1990, illustrating how colloquial the word has become. He writes that one woman in Pennsylvania described to him her journey to become a morning person, while another in Massachusetts was on a journey trying to like fish. And with these two time-worn words, dysfunction and journey, in mind, I intend to take you on a journey through a bit of my dysfunctional growing up years in Hamilton, New York, where back then my father most certainly would have been perceived as strong, my mother undeniably good-looking, and where we four girls were in different ways all above average. Garrison Keillor's idyllic description of Lake Wobegon could have, at first glance, described my own town. After all, Hamilton was small, its surrounding pastures and rural areas lush and green. But the outskirts of Hamilton hid some entrenched rural poverty. One family whose children rode the bus with me on our mile-long ride to school had no electricity or running water. And in direct contrast there, up on the hill, sat Colgate University, a little Ivy college exclusively for young men until the 70s, where my father taught literature for over 30 years. A large, polished gold dome graced the roof of the college chapel, which was located prominently in the center of the campus. It was the view across the valley I saw through the living room window all the years of my childhood until I left home for college at 18. Surrounding our house on two sides was Mr. Zimmer's pasture, where his herd of 30 milk cows grazed peacefully behind miles of barbed wire fencing. Yet in that bucolic and peaceful setting, our four young lives often felt tumultuous, chaotic, and unpredictable. One contributing factor for that defined life for us. That defined life for us was our father's intense need to excel at his craft, to be considered to be among Colgate's top teachers. So when our father's classes went well, he came home with a smile and a lightness to his step. But if the class he'd planned hadn't gone as well as he'd hoped, we girls learned quickly to sense the changing landscape, and we would scatter from the living room to the far end of the house. It's fair to say that he felt compulsively driven to maintain a reputation he'd earned over his years as a true institution at Colgate, a teacher for whom students would line up with sleeping bags to register for his classes the next morning. As a result, we girls and our mother knew we lived with an icon of the university who knew his power and used it at will. For a revered teacher who could define the subtlest complexities of human relationships in Anna Karenina's family, our father was unable, or more likely, perhaps unwilling, to dissect the troubling, complex dynamics of his own. Thinking back on those tumultuous days, I have come to see our large, sunny dining room, a room known in many cultures for sharing food and conversation, as a most unhappy gathering place in our house, a room where anger, divisiveness, and frustration often came to rest. It was in our dining room that, in spite of his daughter's vocal protestations, our father would insist upon cutting our hair. I suppose it was to save money. He came to his task armed only with a barber's electrical razor. Once I was seated on the edge of the table, legs dangling over the side, out would come that dreaded razor and off would come our bangs, usually in a jagged, uneven line. One uneven line would beget another to straighten it, and then another, and the result would be bangs that were cut still cut unevenly, and that were now cut much too short to be what we girls knew to be at all stylish. We girls would invariably cry when we saw the final result, yet this haircutting ritual continued for years. I still remember the sound of his nervous chuckle, seeing and hearing our distress play out during each girl's haircutting session. And I still recall the metallic buzz of that electric razor. He would sit down in his chair at the head of that same drop-leaf table while dinner was being served, and would often snap his fingers while scanning its length and width. This meant that he'd noticed a missing item. We girls and our mother immediately found ourselves also taking stock to identify which item had been forgotten. Napkins, butter, salt, a serving spoon, and then one of us would identify the missing item, rise from the table, and make things right. I recall many a meal ending with tears of frustration around that dinner table. For example, he would invite debate about a topic and then ask for our opinions. But a silent, vehement shake of his head while I offered my tentative response would indicate several sentences in that my response was on the wrong track, and that he would need to redirect my thinking once I'd completed my thought. Hard to imagine a worse classroom strategy, right? And my petition for a large world map to be tacked up on that same dining room wall was also immediately rejected. I recognized, even vaguely, that I often felt adrift in my high school world history class, and that I needed a way to cement an image of the world in my head. Finally, our repeated requests for a television set in the late 50s and for a basketball hoop in the yard when I made the first-string basketball team were also rejected quickly, almost spontaneously, simply, I think, because he could do so without pushback. A television did become part of the dining room furniture the year my youngest sister left for college. The result was a home that, for these and for other reasons, lacked joy and stability for his daughters and for his wife. Our mother's role was that of loving but ineffectual peacemaker in a home with very little room for sharing power or opinions. My memory is that she often looked distressed while seeking to sound quietly at peace. To complicate the family dynamics even further, our father chose a favorite among his children, a child who took to the piano at an early age and who shared his love of classical music. They would spend hours at the piano bench after dinner, my sister working to master sheet music he had chosen for her. Until I was much older, I never considered how this alliance must have hurt my mother. As we grew older and Dad's determination to be heralded as the best of the best took on a new intensity, we girls and our mother became the target of more overt and subtle abuse. The result was that one male authority figure in our household of women maintained control over all decisions, both consequential and small. And instead of feeling able to challenge that powerful authority figure, we girls turned our submerged anger and frustration on each other. I still regret the fact that we weren't able to rise up and support each other in this stressful household. It was every girl and every woman for herself. So the toxic combination of verbal abuse, submerged anger, and overt favoritism among daughters splintered our family relationships, any family relationships that we sisters might have formed. We lived with a loving but powerless mother who found the courage to plead our causes with her husband only once we were out of earshot or at night when the lights were out and our day's anger had submerged once again. It would take 20 years after the death of both parents, between 1993 and 2001, before we sisters would be able to open a dialogue about our years growing up in Hamilton. During those decades, we all sought therapy, married, started families, had miscarriages, divorces, and sought more therapy. All of my three sisters divorced at least one spouse, yet that impenetrable wall stood between us. It was as if we four girls lived on four different planets. How did this fractured group of sisters initiate and finally sustain a decades-long journey to address the dysfunction that permeated their childhood? Living with a man who was considered a treasured icon of the local university, but was driven exacting and controlling to his daughters, meant that we often lived on the edge. But there were complications here too. He was a master storyteller. He could spin the most amazing stories on car trips to Maine, notably while away from the campus. Stories that were detailed, imaginative, tender, filled with brave, complex characters of all ages who survived one dire, life-threatening situation after another. Enthralling stories that revealed a totally different side of this man. Not surprisingly, Dad's later stories always featured himself as the gallant hero, a brave and resourceful fighter pilot, saddled before each flight with a bumbling, incompetent co-pilot. But we girls loved those stories. So we went into our adult lives with threads of competing memories, some only half formed. Warm memories shared space with buried, resentful ones. Adding to this confusing mix were unresolved hard feelings concerning the final division of the family estate following the death of my mother in 2001. So estrangement deepened and resentments festered. We girls, now young women with families of our own, were not ready to look to each other to confirm, question, or reconcile childhood memories. They never got an airing until I reached my 70s. There's no quick fix, no wave of a father's storytelling wand that will magically restore a prolonged and uneasy silence between four sisters who lacked closeness while growing up. Here is how we sisters, very tentatively at first, reached out to begin our journey out of a splintered, dysfunctional childhood. First, after years of therapy and false starts, we finally began an emailing chain. We agreed, somewhat reluctantly, to share news about ourselves and our family members. Each sister was assigned the task of writing a group email once every 3 months. Our emails that year were dry, uninspired, labored. They lacked warmth or any sign of humor. And while I had been the one to introduce this emailing idea, I admit to finding myself a reluctant participant, facing even tangentially the possibility of opening the door to family tumult was a daunting thought to me. So while we all agreed for the need to reach out, we were unable to connect. We were off to a shaky beginning, but at least it was a start. Second, my Seattle sister Tess reached out with 2 weeks' notice to invite my Albany, New York sister Tam and me to join her and her husband for a casual dinner in the North End of Boston. Oh, and would you find us a restaurant, she asked. Michael, my husband, was invited along too. Tess was attending a professional conference in Boston. I am not proud to say that I immediately felt jolted, unmoored, and pressured. I still sought to protect my normal family life I spoke of earlier when we began to email, a safe distance from the fray, sanctioned by my therapist. This safe distance was sanctioned by my therapist years before. I favored that rather than confront, now face-to-face, a daughter who represented the dysfunctional life I recalled. But Tess had extended a daring invitation, forcing my hand. I needed to make that leap, and I knew it. And so I ventured further into an undefined space, and I accepted her invitation with Michael at my side. Following that breakthrough, with 3 of the 4 sisters present, emails among all of us morphed into text messages, which were more immediate, spontaneous, and warmer. Third, in late winter of 2023, this same sister, Tess, faced a sudden health crisis after being diagnosed with several small strokes. Weekly texts became daily ones. There was a sudden realization that the 4 sisters needed to deal with that rusty, partially buried hatchet once and for all. Time was running out. And this is when 2 gold coins left over from the division of my parents' small estate came into play. As the oldest, I had taken charge of these 2 coins, and I determined that they would be cashed in if, at some future time, the sisters decided to gather. They had sat in a safety deposit box for 23 years. So now is the time. I distributed the coin money that would make possible flights to Seattle and food for a week-long gathering. And so for the first week of August, exactly a year ago, we 4 sisters met at Tess's home in Port Townsend, Washington, for an official first supper, you might say, and for a week of talks and long leisurely walks in this beautiful bug-free town located an hour by ferry from Seattle. It was a Lake Wobegon setting, if there ever was one. We talked at times all together and at times in groups of 2 or 3, and we shared conversations, all of us now in our late 60s and 70s, that we had never considered possible. We talked about why our mother's own childhood might have conditioned her to feel powerless, unwilling and unable to confront her husband, and yet why she made decisions ranging from seemingly insignificant to momentous, favoring her husband over her daughters. We discussed how our father's own sad and fractured childhood had profoundly impacted his own view of parenting and what powerless children of his generation might grow up expecting of themselves. And we talked about the many possible reasons for our total estrangement from his 3 brothers, our uncles, and how their sad, depressing, competitive childhood could have predicted the fact that we girls were never offered the opportunity to form relationships with our 3 paternal cousins once we had all reached the age of 7 or 8. Our conversations, albeit long delayed, came with a satisfying realization that we better understood more about why our lives had been so fractured and untethered. We sisters are now able to admit our love for each other, identify the triggers for old conflicts that can still occasionally surface, and we are more able to share our past, a topic that can still spontaneously bubble to the surface during our monthly Zoom calls. That's not to say we always see our lives, both past and present, in the same light, but all 3 of us are now much better at suppressing that occasional eye roll. But we are grateful for the journey we tentatively embarked on together, and we are gentler, kinder, and more understanding with each other. Through individual therapy and our determination to meet and confront our family's dysfunction, we found the path we needed to bury the hatchet and repaint our picket fences. That journey continues. I have a shared reading now in the Universalist. 558, for everything a season. I'm sorry?
Could you repeat what the number is?
558. For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to keep silence and a time to speak. A time for war and a time for peace.
Please join us for a moment of silent reflection. Today's offering is dedicated to the services and ministry of First Parish Milton. Please see the How to Give section of your pew card or the on-screen instructions on Zoom to give. And if you would please rise as you're able and join in the unison dedication, which is, the words are found on the pew card. May these gifts be transformed into strength for this faith community, into comfort, food, and shelter for those in need, and may we be transformed by generosity. And our closing hymn is number 1008 in the teal hymnal.
Today's benediction is one that speaks to my talk this morning. It is simple. It is written by Rumi. Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing or right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there.